February 21st, 1965, 3:10 p.m. Malcolm X, 21 shotgun pellets, 16 bullets, dead before the ambulance arrived. But here's what they never told you. 3 weeks before that ballroom, before the assassination, before the world lost Malcolm X, one man knew it was coming. Bumpy Johnson, Harlem's godfather, the man the FBI couldn't touch, the man the Italians feared. He sat across from Malcolm at 2:47 a.m. in a basement on 138th Street, and he said 5 words that Malcolm X ignored. "They're going to kill you, brother." Malcolm refused protection, refused bodyguards, refused to let Bumpy's men shadow him into that ballroom. 58 years later, the government admitted they convicted innocent men, but they never explained why Malcolm was left unprotected. Because the real story wasn't about who pulled the trigger. It was about who didn't stop it. Comment where you're watching from. Plus, have you heard this version before? This is a conversation that was buried for half a century. The night Bumpy Johnson tried to save Malcolm X. March 8, 1964. Malcolm X boards Pan Am Flight 115 at Kennedy Airport. Destination, Cairo, Egypt. The FBI agent watching from Terminal 3 makes a phone call. 3 words into a payphone receiver. He's going international. That phone call changed everything. Because up until that moment, Malcolm X was containable. A domestic problem. A Nation of Islam minister who preached separation, who told black Americans to defend themselves, who made white liberals uncomfortable at dinner parties. Dangerous, yes, but manageable. The moment that plane left American airspace, Malcolm stopped being a preacher. He became something the United States government couldn't control, a global revolutionary. And they knew it before he did. Rewind 11 days. February 26, 1964. Manhattan Center, New York City. Malcolm X stands before a crowd of 400 people. No bow tie, no Nation of Islam ministers flanking him. Just Malcolm, alone. He announces the formation of Muslim Mosque Incorporated. The papers called it a breakaway sect, a schism. Former Malcolm X splits from Elijah Muhammad. The headlines read. But that wasn't the story. The story was what Malcolm said 47 minutes into that speech. Words that most reporters missed because they were too busy scribbling notes about the religious split. Quote, "The 22 million African Americans in this country are all victims of Americanism, and there's no difference between Mississippi segregation and New York segregation. The only difference is the method. The North is more hypocritical." That line, that single line, is what made the phone ring in J. Edgar Hoover's office the next morning. Because Malcolm wasn't just talking about the South anymore. Wasn't just blaming rednecks and Klansmen. He was saying the entire system, North and South, liberal and conservative, was designed to crush black people. And worse, he was saying it in a way that couldn't be dismissed. No religious doctrine. No talk of blue-eyed devils. Just cold, factual analysis that made northern white liberals realize they weren't the good guys in this story. They were complicit. And complicit people don't like being named. 3 weeks later, Malcolm is in Cairo, then Jeddah, then Lagos, then Accra, Ghana, where he meets Kwame Nkrumah, the president who just kicked the British Empire out of West Africa. They talk for 6 hours. What they discussed was never officially recorded. But 2 days after that meeting, Malcolm sends a telegram back to New York, to his wife, Betty Shabazz. The telegram is short. 11 words. "The struggle is bigger than America. I see it now." Betty would later say that when Malcolm came back from Africa, he was different, not angrier, calmer, like he'd found a missing piece. The missing piece was this. Malcolm had figured out that the civil rights movement, as it was being sold to black Americans, was a trap. Here's why. Civil rights framed the black struggle as an American problem. Segregation, voting rights, equal access, all domestic issues that could be handled through legislation, negotiation, compromise. It kept the fight inside America's borders. It kept the conversation controlled. But human rights made it international. If Malcolm could convince the United Nations that America was violating the human rights of 22 million black citizens, then suddenly it wasn't a domestic issue anymore. It became a global human rights crisis. And that meant other countries could intervene, could apply pressure, could sanction, could isolate America on the world stage the same way South Africa was being isolated for apartheid. Malcolm understood something in 1960, for that wouldn't become common knowledge for another decade. The United States cared more about its international reputation than it cared about justice. The government would rather assassinate leaders than be embarrassed at the UN, and Malcolm was about to embarrass them in front of the entire world. July 17, 1964, Cairo, Egypt, the second summit of the Organization of African Unity. 34 African heads of state in attendance. Malcolm X, representing no government, no official organization, just himself, walks into that summit, and he submits an 8-page memorandum. The title, Appeal to African Heads of State on behalf of 22 million African Americans. The content was surgical. Malcolm cited the UN Charter, Article 2, Article 55, Article 56. He referenced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He quoted back America's own propaganda about freedom and democracy, and then he asked one question. If South Africa's treatment of Africans is a human rights violation worthy of UN intervention, then how is America's treatment of African Americans any different? 18 African nations responded favorably. 18 nations that had voting power in the UN General Assembly. The U.S. State Department went into crisis mode because if Malcolm succeeded, if he got even half those nations to sponsor a resolution condemning America's treatment of black citizens, the international fallout would be catastrophic. America was fighting the Cold War on the narrative that it was a land of freedom, that democracy worked, that capitalism gave everyone a fair shot. Malcolm X was about to prove, in front of the entire world, that it was all a lie, and the FBI knew it. September 1964. Malcolm returns to New York. The Bureau assigns 12 full-time agents to surveil him. Phone taps, mail intercepts, informants inside his mosque, informants inside his security team. They monitor every speech, every meeting, every telegram, and what they discover terrifies them. Malcolm isn't just talking anymore. He's organizing. October 1964, he returns to Africa. This time, he meets with revolutionaries, Patrice Lumumba's former allies in the Congo, anti-colonial fighters in Kenya, Marxist organizers in Tanzania. He's building a network, an international coalition of oppressed people who see America not as a beacon of hope, but as an empire that needs to fall. November 24th, 1964. Malcolm gives a speech at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem, the same ballroom where, 3 months later, he would die. He says this, quote, "It's impossible for a chicken to produce a duck egg. The system of this country cannot produce freedom for an Afro-American. It is impossible for the system, as it stands, to produce freedom right now for the black man in this country." That speech was recorded, transcribed, filed in a folder marked Security Matter Communist. The FBI didn't call Malcolm a threat to segregation anymore. They called him a threat to national security. And here's the thing most people don't understand. Malcolm didn't have to succeed for them to kill him. He just had to try. Because the attempt itself, the international coalition, the UN appeals, the African alliances, that was enough to prove the concept worked. If Malcolm could do it, others would follow. And the U.S. government couldn't allow that blueprint to exist. By December 1964, the decision had already been made. Not officially, not in a memo, not in a meeting room with minutes recorded, but in the way decisions like this are always made. Quietly, through nods, through resource allocation, through agents reassigned, through informants activated. Malcolm X would not live to see 1966. The only question left was how, and who would take the fall. Because here's what they learned from killing John F. Kennedy 1 year earlier. You don't need a perfect plan. You just need confusion, multiple shooters, conflicting witness testimony, rushed investigations, a convenient patsy, Let the conspiracy theories fight each other for 50 years while the truth stays buried. Malcolm X was already a dead man. He just didn't know it yet. And the one person in Harlem who saw it coming, who tried to warn him, who offered protection, Malcolm refused to listen because Malcolm X didn't fear death. He feared dying before finishing the work. That fear was about to come true. August 28, 1967, 2 years after Malcolm X is dead. A break-in occurs at an FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania. The burglars aren't professionals. They're college students, teachers, a taxi driver, 8 ordinary people who picked the lock on a government building and stole every file they could carry. What they found inside those cabinets changed American history. Thousands of documents, surveillance reports, operational memos, instructions written in clinical bureaucratic language describing how to destroy human beings without ever touching them. The program had a name, COINTELPRO, Counterintelligence Program, and Malcolm X had been a target since 1953. Here's what most people don't understand about political assassination. You don't need a lone gunman in a grassy knoll. You don't need CIA hit squads. You don't need covert operations with code names and offshore accounts. You just need patience and paperwork. March 4th, 1968. One of the stolen FBI documents gets published in the Washington Post. It's a single-page memo, dated in 1964. Subject line: Counterintelligence Program, Black Nationalist Hate Groups, Internal Security. The goal, written in plain English: prevent the rise of a Messiah who could unify and electrify the militant Black nationalist movement. Prevent the rise of a Messiah. Not arrest, not prosecute, not convict. Prevent. And the methods listed underneath that goal read like an instruction manual for psychological warfare. Number 1. Pinpoint potential troublemakers and neutralize them before they exercise their potential for violence. Number 2. Prevent militant Black nationalist groups from gaining respectability by discrediting them to the responsible Negro community, to the white community, and to Negro radicals. Number 3. Prevent the long-range growth of these organizations, especially among youth. Number 4. Prevent these groups from recruiting young people. Notice what's missing from that list: evidence, trials, due process. This wasn't law enforcement. This was elimination. And Malcolm X, by 1964, had already checked every box on their threat assessment: international travel, UN appeals, youth organizing, rhetorical skills that could move crowds, a name that carried weight across continents. He was a Messiah they were trying to prevent. So, how do you kill someone without pulling the trigger? You turn their allies into enemies. You make them dangerous to be around. You isolate them until the only people left standing next to them are the ones who want them dead. And then you step back and let nature take its course. June 1964. Malcolm X receives a letter at his home in Queens. No return address. Postmarked from Chicago. The letter claims to be from a concerned member of the Nation of Islam. It warns Malcolm that Elijah Muhammad has put a death contract on him. $50,000 to whoever brings proof of Malcolm's death. Malcolm reads the letter, shows it to his wife, Betty. She's terrified. But here's the thing. The letter wasn't from the Nation of Islam. It was from the FBI. This is what the COINTELPRO files revealed years later. The Bureau had agents writing fake letters, creating fake internal disputes, sending anonymous threats designed to make targets paranoid, erratic, desperate. They wanted Malcolm to see enemies everywhere, because a man who trusts no one can't build a movement, and a man who's constantly looking over his shoulder eventually makes a mistake. July 1964. Malcolm gives a speech in Harlem, mentions casually that he's received death threats, says he's not afraid. 2 days later, another letter arrives. This one is more specific. Names 3 men inside Malcolm's inner circle who are supposedly FBI informants. One of the names is accurate. 2 are loyal supporters who've been with Malcolm since the beginning. Malcolm doesn't know which is which. So what does he do? He starts pulling back, becomes more guarded, stops sharing plans with his team, holds information closer. Exactly what the FBI wanted. Because here's the brilliance of strategy. You don't need to destroy someone's organization from the outside. You make them destroy it from the inside. August 1964. Two of Malcolm's most trusted organizers quit. They don't say why. Just stop showing up to meetings. Stop answering calls. Later, one of them admits he received a letter, supposedly from Malcolm, accusing him of being a government plant. Malcolm never wrote that letter, but the damage was done. By September 1964, Malcolm's inner circle has shrunk from 30 people to 11. By December, it's down to 7. And every single one of those 7 is being surveilled. Phones tapped, mail intercepted, movements tracked. The FBI knows where Malcolm is going before his own security team does. January 14, 1965. Malcolm's house in Queens is firebombed at 2:47 a.m. Malcolm, Betty, and their 4 daughters barely escape. They stand outside in the freezing cold, watching their home burn, while neighbors call the fire department. The police arrive 11 minutes later. They don't ask if the family is okay. They ask Malcolm if he set the fire himself for publicity. That question, that accusation, was planted in the press the next day. The New York Times runs a story suggesting Malcolm might have staged the attack, uses phrases like, "questions remain," and "authorities are investigating all possibilities." The message was clear. Even when Malcolm was the victim, he couldn't be trusted. And if he couldn't be trusted, then he couldn't be protected. Because who's going to risk their life for someone who might be lying? This is the part people forget. The FBI didn't need to kill Malcolm X. They just needed to make sure no one would save him. And they accomplished that through something most people don't recognize as violence: bureaucratic destruction. February 9, 1965, 12 days before Malcolm is killed, a memo circulates inside the New York FBI field office. The subject: Malcolm X's upcoming speech at the Audubon Ballroom on February 21st. The memo recommends passive observation. Passive observation. That means watch but don't intervene, even if violence occurs. At the same time, the New York Police Department receives an internal directive: resource reallocation. Officers assigned to Malcolm's security detail are quietly reassigned to other cases. No official explanation, just a scheduling change. Malcolm's security, which had been 8 NYPD officers rotating shifts, drops to 2, then 1, then none. And Malcolm notices. He mentions it to friends, says the cops have backed off, says it feels like they're waiting for something to happen. But here's the cruelty of the situation. If Malcolm complains publicly, he looks paranoid. If he hires private security, it confirms he's dangerous, that violence follows him, which scares away potential allies. And if he does nothing, he's exposed. There's no winning move. This is when the rumors start circulating in Harlem. Whispers in barbershops. Conversations in pool halls. Someone's going to try something. Malcolm's living on borrowed time. The brothers from a nation are coming for him. And one name keeps appearing in those conversations: Bumpy Johnson. Because if anyone in Harlem could stop what was coming, it was him. Now, let's be very clear about who Bumpy Johnson was in 1965. He wasn't a hero, wasn't a civil rights activist, wasn't marching for voting rights or integration. Bumpy Johnson was a criminal. He ran numbers, controlled protection rackets, had politicians on payroll, and cops in his pocket. He'd killed men, ordered violence, built an empire on fear and loyalty. But Bumpy understood power in a way Malcolm's political allies didn't. He understood that in Harlem, the law didn't protect black people. The police didn't serve black communities. The government didn't care if black leaders lived or died. So Bumpy created his own system, his own rules, his own justice. And part of that system was this: Harlem takes care of its own. Malcolm X was Harlem's son, born Malcolm Little in Omaha, but raised in the consciousness of every black neighborhood in America. And even though Malcolm had distanced himself from street life, even though he preached against the vices Bumpy profited from, there was respect, mutual, unspoken, complicated respect. Because Bumpy saw what Malcolm was trying to do, saw the international organizing. the UN appeals, the coalition building, and Bumpy knew from experience what happens to black men who threaten the system. They disappear, or they die. So according to multiple oral histories, testimonies collected years later from people who were there, Bumpy Johnson made an offer, not publicly, not through official channels, but through intermediaries, through messages passed in Harlem's underground network. The offer was simple: protection, no strings attached, no favors owed, no compromise required. Just men, armed, loyal, positioned around Malcolm wherever he went. Men who wouldn't ask questions, wouldn't hesitate, wouldn't fail, because Bumpy's men weren't idealists. They were soldiers. And soldiers understand one thing: you protect what's yours. But Malcolm said no. Or at least, that's what the stories say. There's no signed document, no recorded meeting, no paper trail, just overlapping testimonies from people who claimed to have been in the room when the offer was made, and timing that haunts history. Why would Malcolm refuse? Several reasons. First, optics. Malcolm was trying to build legitimacy, international credibility. He was meeting with heads of state, speaking at universities, positioning himself as a serious political thinker. Being associated with Harlem's most notorious gangster would undermine that. The press would destroy him. Malcolm X, protected by organized crime. Malcolm X, dependent on a drug dealer for survival. The headlines write themselves. Second principle: Malcolm had spent years preaching self-reliance, black empowerment. The idea that black people didn't need white saviors, didn't need the government, didn't need anyone but themselves. Accepting protection from Bumpy, a man whose empire was built on exploiting black suffering, would contradict everything Malcolm stood for. Third faith: Malcolm believed deeply that if he was doing the right work, if his cause was just, then God would protect him. Or if God didn't, then his death would serve a purpose. Martyrdom to Malcolm wasn't failure. It was completion. So he refused. And Bumpy, according to the stories, didn't push, just nodded, said something to the effect of, "When you change your mind, you know where to find me." But Malcolm never came back. Now here's the question that no one wants to ask. If protection was offered and rejected, who carries the weight of that decision? Is it Malcolm's fault for refusing help? Is it Bumpy's fault for not insisting? Or is it the fault of the system that forced a revolutionary to choose between survival and credibility? Because that's the trap. The FBI didn't just isolate Malcolm physically. They isolated him morally, made it impossible for him to accept help without compromising his mission, made survival itself a betrayal of principle. And then, days later, something changed. February 14th, 1965, 1 week before the assassination, Malcolm gives a speech at the Audubon Ballroom. It's a Sunday afternoon, maybe 400 people in attendance. He's talking about the organization of Afro-American unity, about upcoming projects, about hope. And then mid-sentence he stops, looks around the room, says this: "Some of you sitting here today are not who you say you are." The room goes silent. Malcolm continues, "There are people in this room who've been sent to watch me, to report back, and that's fine. I have nothing to hide." But his tone isn't defiant. It's tired, like a man who's finally realizing he's been fighting alone. After the speech, Malcolm's chief of security, a man named Reuben Francis, approaches him. Reuben has been with Malcolm for months. Loyal, dedicated. He says, "Brother Malcolm, we need more men. The security team is stretched too thin. If something happens, we can't cover every angle." Malcolm looks at him, says, "If it's meant to happen, it'll happen. We do what we can with what we have." Reuben later described that conversation as the moment he knew Malcolm had accepted his fate. February 20th, 1965, the day before the assassination. Malcolm is at home with Betty and their daughters. It's a Saturday. Quiet. Domestic. Betty asks him if he's afraid. Malcolm says, "I've been afraid every day since I left the nation, but fear doesn't change what's coming. It just makes the waiting worse." That night, Malcolm doesn't sleep. He sits at his desk, writes letters, makes phone calls. One of those calls is to a reporter named Gordon Parks, who later published the conversation. Malcolm tells him, "I'm probably a dead man already. I just want to make sure the work continues after I'm gone." And then, the next morning, February 21st, 1965, Malcolm X walks into the Audubon Ballroom. 3 p.m., 400 people waiting. Security team of 7 men, down from 20 the previous month. No metal detectors, no bag checks, no police presence. Malcolm X was one of the most surveilled men in America. The FBI had agents watching him, informants reporting his every move, wiretaps recording his phone calls. They knew where he was going. They knew when he'd be there. They knew he'd be vulnerable. And yet, at the exact moment he needed protection, there was none. No NYPD officer stationed outside. No federal agents monitoring the crowd. Just Malcolm, his small security team, and a room full of people, some of whom wanted him dead. Coincidence or coordination? 3:05 p.m. Malcolm takes the stage. He greets the crowd. Assalamu alaikum. They respond. Wa alaikum salam. Malcolm begins his speech. 30 seconds later, a disturbance erupts near the back of the room. 2 men start arguing, shouting, pushing. Malcolm's security rushes toward the commotion. Standard procedure. Break up the fight. Remove the troublemakers. But while security is distracted, 3 men in the front row stand up. One pulls a sawed-off shotgun from under his coat. Fires. The first blast hits Malcolm in the chest. He stumbles backward. The other 2 men rush the stage. Pistols drawn. They fire. Again. 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 21 rounds total. Malcolm falls. The crowd scatters. Screaming. Chaos. By the time security realizes what's happening, the shooters are already running for the exits. One gets caught, beaten by the crowd, arrested. The other 2 escape. Malcolm X is pronounced dead at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital at 3:30 p.m., 30 minutes after the first shot was fired. And then came the arrests. 3 men, eventually, Talmadge Hayer, Norman 3X Butler, Thomas 15X Johnson, all members of the Nation of Islam, all convicted of first-degree murder, all sentenced to life in prison. Case closed, or so they said. But here's what the jury never heard. Norman Butler and Thomas Johnson both had alibis. Multiple witnesses placed them miles away from the Audubon Ballroom at the time of the shooting. The NYPD ignored those witnesses. Talmadge Hayer, the only shooter caught at the scene, testified in court that Butler and Johnson weren't involved. Named 2 other men as the actual shooters. The prosecution dismissed his testimony. And the FBI, they had undercover officers inside the Audubon Ballroom that day. They watched Malcolm die, and they did nothing. 56 years later, in 2021, the convictions of Butler and Johnson were vacated. The state of New York admitted they'd imprisoned innocent men, admitted evidence had been withheld, admitted the investigation was compromised, but they never explained why Malcolm was left unprotected, never explained who gave the order to pull security, never explained why the FBI agents in the room didn't intervene. Because the truth is too ugly. The government didn't need to kill Malcolm X. They just needed to make sure no one saved him. And they succeeded. But there was one man in Harlem who saw it coming. One man who offered protection. One man who could have changed history. And Malcolm said no. Was that courage? Or was it the final fatal trap? November 17th, 2021. Manhattan Supreme Court. Courtroom 1530. A judge reads a statement that should have been read 56 years earlier. Quote, "The murder convictions of Muhammad Aziz and Khalil Islam are hereby vacated. The people of the state of New York acknowledge that these men were wrongfully convicted. Evidence was suppressed. Witnesses were ignored. Justice was denied. The courtroom is packed. Reporters, activists, family members of the wrongfully convicted men. But 2 chairs remain empty. Muhammad Aziz, formerly known as Norman 3X Butler, is 83 years old. He's there, alive to see his name cleared. Khalil Islam, formerly known as Thomas 15X Johnson, died in 2009. He spent 22 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. He died still telling anyone who'd listen, "I wasn't there. I didn't kill Malcolm." Nobody believed him until 2021. Here's what the district attorney admitted in that courtroom. The FBI had multiple informants inside the Nation of Islam. At least 2 were present during Malcolm X's assassination. Those informants were never disclosed to the defense. The NYPD had undercover officers inside the Audubon Ballroom that day. Their identities were never revealed. Critical witness statements that contradicted the prosecution's case were withheld from the jury. Documents proving Butler and Johnson had alibis were buried in classified files. The DA called it one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in New York history. But here's what he didn't say. Why? Why were 2 innocent men convicted? Why was evidence hidden? Why did the FBI, the NYPD, the district attorney's office all coordinate to imprison men they knew didn't pull the trigger? Because the wrong men were the right scapegoats. And scapegoats serve a purpose. They close cases. They satisfy the public's need for justice. And most importantly, they protect the people who actually did it. Let's go back to February 21st, 1965, 3:10 p.m., the moment the shooting stops. Chaos, screaming, Malcolm's body on the stage, blood spreading across the wood floor. The crowd scatters. Some people run for the exits. Others drop to the ground, covering their heads. And in that chaos, 2 men walk calmly out the front door, not running, not panicking, walking like they'd just attended a Sunday service. Witnesses later described them. One tall, light-skinned, wearing a dark coat. The other shorter, stockier, with a limp. Several people saw them leave. One witness, a man named Thomas Hagen, even chased after them, tried to stop them, but they disappeared into the Harlem streets. Gone. Meanwhile, inside the ballroom, one shooter didn't escape, Talmadge Hayer. He tried to run, but the crowd caught him, beat him, broke his leg, held him until the police arrived. Hayer was arrested on the scene, gun still in his possession, gunpowder residue on his hands. Witnesses who saw him shoot Malcolm, open and shut. Except Talmadge Hayer immediately told police, "I did it, but I didn't do it alone. And the 2 men who helped me, they're not the ones you're looking for." The police ignored him. 5 days later, on February 26, 1965, NYPD arrests Norman Butler and Thomas Johnson. Both men are known members of the Nation of Islam. Both men have records. Assault, weapons charges, ties to violence, perfect suspects. Here's the problem. Norman Butler was at home in the Bronx at the time of the shooting. His wife testified to this. His neighbors confirmed it. He had an alibi that placed him 12 miles away from the Audubon Ballroom. Thomas Johnson was at a hospital in Manhattan visiting his sick child. Hospital records show he signed in at 2:30 p.m. Multiple witnesses, including nurses and other visitors, saw him there until after 4 p.m. He couldn't have been at the assassination. Physically impossible. But the NYPD arrested them anyway, and the prosecution built a case around them anyway, and a jury convicted them anyway, because the case wasn't about truth. It was about narrative. Here's the narrative the government needed. Malcolm X was killed by members of the Nation of Islam, not by the FBI, not by the CIA, not by NYPD informants or undercover agents, by angry black Muslims who hated Malcolm for leaving the faith. A simple story, internal conflict, religious extremism, violence within the black community, nothing to do with the government. And if you arrest 2 well-known Nation members, men with violent pasts, men the public already fears, then the story writes itself. The jury doesn't need evidence. They just need belief. And in 1966, white jurors in New York were more than willing to believe that black Muslims killed each other over theological disputes. The trial began on January 12, 1966. 11 months after Malcolm's death, the prosecution's case was built on 3 pillars: Pillar 1. Talmadge Hayer's presence at the scene. Undeniable. He was caught. Confessed. No dispute. Pillar 2. Eyewitness testimony placing Butler and Johnson at the Audubon Ballroom. This is where it gets ugly. The prosecution called 4 witnesses who claimed to have seen Butler and Johnson at the scene. But here's what the jury didn't hear. 3 of those 4 witnesses had originally told police they didn't recognize the shooters. Their statements changed only after being interrogated multiple times. One witness, Kerry Thomas, testified that he saw Thomas Johnson fire a gun at Malcolm. But Thomas also admitted, under cross-examination, that he'd been shown photographs of Johnson by police before the lineup. He'd been coached. Another witness, a woman named Verna Mason, initially told police the shooter she saw was light-skinned. Thomas Johnson is dark-skinned. Her testimony changed 3 weeks later. Pillar 3. Motive. The prosecution argued that Butler and Johnson, as loyal Nation members, killed Malcolm for betraying Elijah Muhammad, but they never provided evidence of a direct order, never produced communications, never linked Butler or Johnson to any conspiracy, just assumptions. And assumptions were enough. The defense tried to fight back, brought witnesses who testified Butler and Johnson weren't at the Audubon, presented alibis, highlighted inconsistencies in the prosecution's timeline. But the jury had already decided, March 11, 1966, guilty on all counts. Norman Butler, Thomas Johnson, and Talmadge Hayer, life in prison. Except Talmadge Hayer refused to let it end there. During the trial, Hayer testified that Butler and Johnson were innocent. He named the actual shooters. 2 men, William Bradley and Leon Davis. He described how the assassination was planned, where they met, how they coordinated. He begged the jury, don't convict these men for something they didn't do. The jury ignored him. Why would a convicted murderer try to exonerate his co-defendants? What did Hayer have to gain? Nothing. He was already going to prison for life. But he told the truth anyway, and the system buried it. Years later, in 1977, Hayer signed an affidavit repeating his confession, named Bradley and Davis again, described the conspiracy in detail. That affidavit was filed with the court and ignored again. Why? Because if Butler and Johnson were innocent, then the entire case collapses. If the wrong men were convicted, then who actually planned the assassination? And if the real planners were never caught, then who protected them? The FBI. That's who. Here's what the 2021 exoneration revealed. The FBI had at least 5 informants inside the Nation of Islam's New York mosque in 1965. One of them was in Malcolm's inner circle. Another was in the Audubon Ballroom on February 21st. The FBI knew an assassination attempt was being planned. They had advanced intelligence. And they did nothing. Not because they didn't care, but because they wanted Malcolm dead. And if the Nation of Islam did it for them, all the better. No blowback. No Senate hearings. No international scandal. Just another dead black radical, killed by his own people. Perfect. But here's where it gets worse. The FBI didn't just withhold evidence. They destroyed it. Files were shredded. Tapes were erased. Informant identities were sealed. And when civil rights lawyers filed Freedom of Information requests in the 1970s, demanding Malcolm's FBI file, they were told most of it was classified. National security. National security. Malcolm X, a civil rights leader, a preacher, and organizer, was classified as a national security threat even after death. His files remained sealed until 2021. 56 years. And even now, after the exoneration, after the apologies, after the admission of misconduct, there are still files that haven't been released. Still informants whose names are redacted. Still witnesses who died without ever giving testimony. Still questions that will never be answered. Because here's the truth most people don't want to hear. Some truths aren't hidden because they're false. They're hidden because they're destabilizing. Because if the public knew the full extent of what the government did to Malcolm X, to Martin Luther King Jr., to Fred Hampton, to every black leader who challenged the system, there would be riots. There would be demands for accountability. There would be a reckoning. And the state can't allow that. So they bury the files, seal the evidence, classify the crimes, and hope that by the time the truth comes out, everyone involved is already dead. Muhammad Aziz walked out of that courtroom in 2021 a free man, legally, but he'd spent 20 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, lost his youth, his family, his reputation. And when reporters asked him how he felt, he said this, quote, "I'm not angry. I'm numb, because no amount of justice now brings back what was stolen." Khalil Islam never got to see his name cleared, died in 2009, still fighting, still insisting he was innocent. His daughters were in the courtroom in 2021. They cried, not tears of joy, tears of rage, because exoneration doesn't resurrect the dead. It just proves the system knew it was wrong all along, and did it anyway. So if they lied about this, if they framed two innocent men, destroyed evidence, buried files, and let the real killers walk free, what else did they lie about? What other assassinations were blamed on the wrong people? What other movements were destroyed from the inside? What other leaders were surveilled, sabotaged, and eliminated while the public was told it was self-inflicted? And here's what they still won't release: the names of the FBI informants inside the Audubon Ballroom, the identities of the NYPD undercover officers who watched Malcolm die, the communications between the FBI, the NYPD, and the Nation of Islam in the weeks leading up to February 21st, the full surveillance files on Bumpy Johnson. Because yes, Bumpy was being watched, too. February 22nd, 1965, one day after Malcolm's assassination, FBI agents show up at Bumpy Johnson's apartment on Convent Avenue at 6 a.m. No warrant, no explanation, just questions. Where were you yesterday afternoon? Did you have contact with Malcolm X? Did you offer him protection? Bumpy, sitting in his kitchen, drinking coffee, doesn't answer, just stares at them. The kind of stare that says, "You already know the answers. You've been listening to my phone, reading my mail, following me for years." The agents leave without arresting him, but the message was clear: stay out of this. And Bumpy did. No retaliation, no public statements, no efforts to find the real killers. Just silence. Complete, calculated silence. Why? Because Bumpy Johnson understood something most people didn't. Power doesn't always fight. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it watches. Sometimes survival requires swallowing rage and playing the long game. If Bumpy had retaliated, if he'd gone after the men who killed Malcolm, if he'd used his network to hunt down the shooters, what would have happened? Federal crackdown, RICO charges, arrests of his entire operation. The FBI was waiting for an excuse to dismantle Bumpy's empire. Malcolm's death gave them the perfect opportunity. All Bumpy had to do was react. And he didn't. That silence, that refusal to engage, that's not weakness. That's strategy. Because Bumpy knew that the government wanted a race war, wanted black communities to tear each other apart, wanted criminals and activists to destroy each other, so the state wouldn't have to. And Bumpy refused to play that role. But silence has consequences, too, because by doing nothing, Bumpy allowed the narrative to solidify, allowed the wrong men to be convicted, allowed Malcolm's killers to walk free. And some people in Harlem never forgave him for that. There's a story, unconfirmed, passed down through Harlem barbershops and street corners, that in 1967, 2 years after Malcolm's death, Bumpy had a conversation with one of his lieutenants. The lieutenant asked, "Why didn't we do something? Why didn't we protect him?" Bumpy allegedly responded, "Because protection only works if the person being protected wants to live." Malcolm wanted to be a martyr, and martyrs don't need bodyguards. They need witnesses. Whether that conversation happened or not, the sentiment is clear. Bumpy understood that Malcolm's death, as tragic as it was, served a purpose. It exposed the system, proved that the government would kill its own citizens to maintain control, turned Malcolm into a symbol more powerful than any speech he could have given. And maybe that's the most disturbing part of this entire story. Malcolm's assassination wasn't a failure. It was a success. Not for Malcolm, not for his family, not for the movement, but for the state. Because here's what happened after Malcolm died. The Black Panther Party rose, adopted Malcolm's revolutionary rhetoric, armed themselves, organized communities, and the FBI destroyed them. COINTELPRO infiltrated every chapter, assassinated leaders, framed members, turned allies into informants. By 1972, the Panthers were finished. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, radicalized after Malcolm's death, embraced Black power, kicked out white members. The FBI dismantled them through the same tactics. By 1973, SNCC was gone. Every organization that tried to do what Malcolm envisioned, international coalitions, armed self-defense, economic independence, was neutralized, not through debates, not through elections, through surveillance, sabotage, and assassination. And the question that won't die, the question that haunts every documentary, every book, every conversation about Malcolm X, is this: what happens when Black political power and Black street power almost align? When the activist and the gangster, the revolutionary and the hustler, see the same enemy and consider, even for a moment, working together. The state steps in, immediately, violently, permanently, because Malcolm X organizing Harlem's intellectuals was manageable. Bumpy Johnson controlling Harlem streets was manageable. But Malcolm and Bumpy together? That's an army the government couldn't infiltrate, couldn't buy off, couldn't control. They didn't kill an alliance. They killed the possibility of one. And the execution was so clean, so effective, that 60 years later, most people still believe Malcolm was killed by jealous Muslims, still believe Bumpy was just a criminal with no political consciousness, still believe the two lived in separate worlds. But they didn't. They lived in the same Harlem, walked the same streets, saw the same oppression, and for a brief moment, in a basement on 138th Street, at 2:47 a.m., they saw each other, not as preacher and gangster, but as two Black men trying to survive a system designed to kill them both. One chose martyrdom, the other chose silence, and the government got exactly what it wanted. So here's the question you need to ask yourself. Should governments ever be allowed to bury history? Should evidence be classified for 56 years? Should innocent men die in prison while the guilty walk free just because the truth is inconvenient? Because if the answer is yes, then we're not living in a democracy. We're living in a system where power protects itself at any cost. And the cost is always paid by the people who challenge it. Malcolm X challenged it, and he died. Bumpy Johnson saw what happened, and he survived. But survival isn't victory. It's just delayed justice. And justice delayed is justice denied. You watch the government frame two innocent men and let a revolutionary bleed out on a ballroom floor. You watch history get buried, rewritten, and sealed for 56 years. And right now you're about to scroll away, like this never happened. Like you didn't just learn something they spent half a century making sure you never knew. Malcolm X died for this truth. Two innocent men rotted in prison for this truth. Bumpy Johnson carried this silence to his grave. And you're about to forget it in 3 seconds because your feed is already pulling you somewhere else. So here's what I need you to do. Not for me, for Malcolm, for the man who died in that prison, for every Black leader this country erased and called it justice. Subscribe so the next story doesn't get buried either. Like this video, because the algorithm decides what people see. And right now, it's deciding whether this truth reaches thousands or disappears. Share this with one person, just one, someone who needs to hear what this country did and called it freedom. And drop a comment right now. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you already knew the story. Tell me if this changed how you see things. Because if you say nothing, if you just watch and scroll, then the silence you keep is the same silence that let Malcolm die unprotected. You know the truth now. What you do with it is on you.